Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In today's bonus author interview, I sit down with author and journalist DW Gibson to talk about his latest book, 1 Week to Change the World, an oral history of the 1999 World Trade Organization protests. Now, this book is very unique for this podcast in several ways. First of all, 1999 is certainly the latest year that I have ever covered a work of history. In fact, I consider that almost contemporary days. The other thing that's really unique about this book is that it is an oral history. It's almost at times like reading the transcript of a really, really well done documentary, in that it's not written as a narrative history. It's written using all the source data and interviews from really important people, all the way up to, some of my people will remember, Ralph Nader, the guy from the 2000 election. So he's in this one as well, and is a really fascinating look. It's interesting to remember that in late 1999, over 1 week, about 50,000 people converged on Seattle with one goal, and that was to shut down the World Trade Organization conference. And there were all kinds of different people there. There were environmentalists, there were blue collar, working class people, and they were all opposing one thing: globalization. And in the end, what's kind of amazing is that they did it. They shut it down. And it's a really kind of fascinating look at what is, for once, a successful protest movement, as in it actually accomplished its objective short-term goal in 1 week. Now, the book is available right now if you are listening to this. So if you're so inclined now, let's move right on to the interview with DW Gibson. All right, and welcome back. As I mentioned previously, I'm sitting down with historian D.W. Gibson talking about his latest book, 1 Week to Change the World. It's a history of Seattle's 1999 World Trade Organization protests. And I actually want to start out at the beginning with a question that I don't usually ask, because I usually do narrative history works, and this one's unique. It's different. I really enjoyed reading it, but I think at the beginning we should probably take a second and explain the structure through which the book is written, because I really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, it's an oral history, So this project is one where I do my best to just stay out of the way, and let others who were there and a part of the actual action tell the story. So what that meant is, over the course of the last couple of years, connecting with over 100 people who were involved in the protests. And that means from every angle. So of course I talked to organizers and protesters and people that were in the street, but I also talked to people that were working in the mayor's office and working in various law enforcement agencies, not just the police department, but the sheriff and FBI and Washington State Patrol. All of them became involved at various points. Delegates from the WTO who were involved in the actual meetings, getting their perspective. My goal was to give a 360-degree view, that sort of, perspective that captures all of the action from all of the different viewpoints. And so that the story could be told as comprehensively as possible. That was my goal, and as balanced as possible. I mean, certainly there's, I think, sort of a point of view that comes through in the book collectively through all of the voices, but certainly wanted to make sure that the voices were rounded and that we were hearing from everyone who was part of the action.
Well, I think it was very well-rounded. And, it's kind of like, at times, I watch a lot of documentaries and I really enjoy documentaries. And at times I thought, like, this is almost like the transcript of a really well-done documentary, where you sort of are getting full views, but it's all primary sources. I mean, how many revisions did you have to go through? How long did this take? I mean, trying to see how I would fit all these puzzle pieces together, it seems like such a daunting task.
Puzzle pieces. Yeah, that's a great word. And it is a big task and it is a long process. And I'm blessed to have a very good editor and others, other writers who sort of helped me through the early drafts of the book. But yeah, puzzle pieces is the word, because what would happen is I would be speaking to someone, let's say from law enforcement, and they'd be telling about a very certain incident that happened on a very specific day, because these protests stretched out over the course of a week. And and something that one individual would say would sort of send off sort of a firework in my mind and my memory, and I would recall something that someone else had said about the same incident from another perspective, and I could sort of see those two things going together in the book. And so it was about keeping track of those sort of light bulb moments when I would hear things echo other comments people had made, or even push back on comments people had made, or seem to respond to comments people had made. So yeah, it was really sort of a big mosaic almost, trying to find the best way to put it all together. Now, I was aided in this particular project by a natural timeline, right? There's actual chronology that happens from Monday to Friday. So I really use that as my North Star in terms of how to put things together. And that made the job approachable in terms of framework and structure, knowing that the chronology would sort of be my guiding map. The difficulty really was in the sort of the front section of the book and the closing section of the book, where the sort of chronology of that week isn't so central. The first part of the book is much more about all the prep work that went into it. I mean, months and months of training and organizing and all kinds of activity that led up to that week, making sure that I was picking the optimal way to present all that information. And then the last section of the book where people really process what happened, really try to figure out what it means 25 years later. Some certain themes emerge there, and I try to identify those and present them in the sort of most dynamic way possible for readers.
Well, I definitely want to come back to the themes later on here, because I think a lot of the themes are still very relevant to the world today, that sort of developed throughout that week and are developed throughout the book. But kind of starting from an initial, let's walk into the book. The book is about a week of protests and meetings around the World Trade Organization in Seattle, as we mentioned. But I think it makes sense to kind of lay the stage of why was this opposition to the World Trade Organization brewing as we get to the end of the last millennium? Because for a long time, the World Trade Organization was seen as nothing but a positive, for globalization and for the world. So I don't want to say that people were caught off guard necessarily, some were, but where was the source of this discontent?
So many sources. And I think that's why it was such a big protest or big week of protests. It's interesting. It's something I didn't quite realize until I got into the early research for the project, but that the WTO was really, on the one hand, was sort of in its infancy. I mean, there had been an earlier iteration called GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs, and that sort of stretched back to World War II and been around for a while. But World Trade Organization, this idea of creating an international body to govern trade, yes, but really sort of more broadly speaking, capitalism, right? Because 90s is when we really see globalization setting in a very modern way. And the Clinton administration was very much about that and had brought much enthusiasm for making that happen. So it was really just taking off in this very certain way after 1994, when it had formally been chartered and recognized World Trade Organization. So it was all very fresh. And, there was an underlying principle that I think brought people to the protests. And again, people came for all kinds of different reasons. But the principle was this, that the WTO was an international body that was trying to establish rules for trade that all participating nations had to abide by. And it was creating methods for enforcing those rules of trade, right? What that meant was, even if any particular nation state that was a part of the World Trade Organization had certain laws or policies with regard to, let's say, work standards, wage standards, environmental standards, those things could be overridden by the WTO. You could say that's a trade barrier, right? And so this is something that caught the attention of a lot of different people because, again, if you're worried about environmental considerations, that raises alarm bells for you. If you're worried about workers' rights and labor, that raises alarm bells for you, right? If you're concerned about democracy, right, and sort of access to sort of laws and enforcement of laws that you participate in whatever nation state you live in, that raises issues for a lot of people. So there were and debt relief, right? So this idea of because debt management through the IMF and WTO was sort of seen as associated with those efforts. A lot of people had issue with debt relief and debt agreements with poorer nations, developing nations that were clearly never going to be able to get out from the interest payments from the debt they were accruing. So many different entry points. And that's why you had ministers there that were part of the Jubilee process, trying to address debt relief around the world. You had labor unions there marching side by side with environmentalists. Those are two camps that had traditionally been viewed as diametrically opposed. Labor always sort of viewed environmental movements, broadly speaking, as threatening to work and to jobs. So you had an opportunity to build really special coalitions that otherwise would probably be pretty hard to bring together.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because the WTO and other organizations, we're talking about sort of supranational organizations here, organizations that require different countries to give up a percentage of their sovereignty, whatever that percentage is, in order to really further the aims of globalism, capitalism, to the extent that we want to make that argument. And this was, the 90s was the period when NAFTA came into being, when we start to see a lot of these trade treaties go down, where the idea is that we're going to move away from tariffs, we're going to move away from protectionism, and we're going to start to move towards a more globalized economy. But of course, anytime you make a change, there's winners and losers, and that's what brings different groups together. I mean, yeah, you can imagine why a labor union might oppose this, because now all of a sudden, without a tariff, you may have to compete against production in a country that doesn't have labor unions, or where the unions just simply don't have as much power, and that really undercuts the ability to be competitive financially in the long run. And that's really, to be honest, that's a stress point we're still dealing with today, isn't it?
Absolutely. You're right to reference NAFTA, because NAFTA, 5 years before these protests had already been setting in. And that's why labor unions were so involved, the Teamsters, AFL-CIO, and all of the associated unions there, very much at the center of this organizing, because they had already been burned by NAFTA. And we're still dealing with that, right, is an issue. And even sort of the revision of NAFTA attempted to address some of these issues and in some regards put in place some more protection for workers, which are good. But this issue of capitalism's ability to go around the world and find the cheapest labor, that's not gone away, as you really aptly point out. It always reminds me of the Jack Welch proposal, right? And it's referenced in the book. One of the individuals I interviewed talked about it. Jack Welch made a sort of hypothetical proposal that he'd love to just sort of have a big barge that he could move around the world wherever the cheapest labor was, so that he could hire those individuals. Capitalism is that's how it works, right? It's ruthless in its pursuit of the cheapest possible labor. So, and while labor isn't the only consideration, it certainly was a major one that brought a lot of people to these protests.
Yeah, and I think that, that's one of those issues, and I kept thinking this throughout the book, that it almost seems like this anti-globalization is one of those rare moments when people on the right and the left manage to somehow agree on something. To what was that true during even the 1999 protests as you cover them?
Yes, it was true. And to me, that's one of the most fascinating parts of the story, the coalitions that were built. I mean, totally unconventional. So you had people like Sherrod Brown and Dennis Kucinich there. Tom Hayden was there from, Chicago 68. He was there as part of these protests. But then you also had people like Pat Buchanan there, right? So there are all kinds of reasons for people to get angry or nervous or upset about globalization. And some of those are troubling, right? People can be upset about globalization for xenophobic reasons or racist reasons, right? They're bad reasons. But the point is that across the political spectrum, people feel threatened by sort of the diminution of their democracy and their personal liberty. I mean, there were even anarchists there who told me, it wasn't even about democracy. It was about liberty. It was about personal liberty. And I take that point. I think it was about both, right? But even just sort of that individual autonomy, right, was at the heart of things. And I feel, and this comes up a lot in many of the interviews I did for the book, the left has sort of abandoned this. I should say the sort of political left, the conventional left, the Democratic Party, because Clinton was very gung-ho on all of this, and the Democratic Party has largely stayed very supportive of the idea of globalization in a generic way, and we think of the GOP as sort of resistant to it. But really, there's a lot of reasons across the political spectrum to push back on it, and I think that you see that with Bernie Sanders, right? So not a member of the Democratic Party, but someone who caucuses with them and sort of aligns by and large. A great example of someone on the left, the far left of that, who sees all of these concerns that were, encouraging people to participate in the protests in Seattle.
Yeah, I find that so interesting that, sometimes you'll hear the word populist or populism sort of thrown around a lot. And it's such a broad definition that oftentimes it's interesting the number of people who can be sort of put under that umbrella and have it still sort of, I guess, make a sort of cognitive sense to it. But actually, one of the people that I really want to ask you about from the book is Ralph Nader. Just because, he's a name that I grew up with, that I knew very well. And so as soon as I saw him, and every time that, he was speaking, and it is him speaking because it's his interviews, throughout the book, I was really kind of interested to cue in on him. But I know that a lot of my listeners sort of know that name. They know who it is. And if you could just talk for a minute about his role in this week-long protest, like I found him really an interesting figure because he's on the left, of course, but at the same time finds himself in the situation where he is sort of opposed to this globalization that, of course, the current Democratic president, Bill Clinton, is pushing.
Yeah. Nader is such a fascinating part of the story. And, he started Public Citizen, a big nonprofit, DC based. And one of the great dynamics of Seattle was you had these big politically oriented NGOs in DC, like Public Citizen, like Sierra Club, that were involved. But you also had individual players, that individual anarchists or small groups of anarchists, people who were really kind of antagonistic towards that DC establishment. So that's an important dynamic. And Nader was part of that DC sort of establishment, if you will, in terms of big NGOs and big footprints. And what that also means is money and resources, right? So Public Citizen and Ralph Nader were able to bring money and resources to Seattle to help fund a lot of the activity, a lot of the training that went on for months and months ahead of time. I think it's important to recognize, too, that one of the major tales of the protests really was Ralph Nader's 2000 presidential run. That the point is made in the book, and it's very true, that his presidential platform was really sort of an extension of the protests that had happened in Seattle months earlier. He was talking about trade and the issues around globalization when neither of the other candidates, Gore or Bush at that point, really wanted to talk about it at all. And obviously, the sort of Nader presidential run gets lost in other sort of important stories in terms of hanging Chads and, Supreme Court decision and taking 3% of the vote and all of that. But those issues aside, is another, story entirely. This popular widespread pushback on the cautions around globalization are really embodied in Ralph Nader and the work he's done since then, and his 2000 presidential run.
Yeah, those who are at least people of my age will remember Ralph Nader mostly for the 2000 election. I mean, you can argue, George W. Bush won Florida by less than 1,000 votes. And that percentage probably was decisive in sort of turning that. And it's an interesting historical what if. But at the same time, he was very much, I guess, for younger generations, almost like the Bernie Sanders of his day in terms of how he did those sorts of things. You brought up an interesting point in that question that I wanted to ask another question about, which is sort of this idea of like the different groups coming together, because you have some really big groups who are involved in the protest, and then you have some really small niche groups who are involved in the protest. So how did those operate differently, and in what ways do they sort of complement each other? Because it struck me as though they did, certainly.
They did, and the ability for let's say anarchists. I use that term in a sort of small a kind of way, right? Is sort of a person who emphasizes individuality over all else, and personal autonomy. You had people that were doing that on their own and in small informal groups that were there and central and part of the organizing. And like I said, you had these big NGOs, and they were absolutely complementary of each other. There were difficulties in bringing those two groups together, just like there's difficulty in bringing environmentalists and labor unions together, right? But again, it shows you the power of these protests and the pushback on globalization, because all of those parties were willing to find a way to work together, to find a way to support each other. And they did it in their own ways. So those more, let's say, individual actors and informal groups, they organized around a space that they called the convergent space. It was a empty warehouse in downtown Seattle that they used for training exercises, how to keep your cool, right, when the sort of intensity on the street with the police, where they built big puppets. Theater and culture was a big part of the protests. They built big puppets. They learned how to use lock boxes, right, to lock themselves in arm to arm so that they could block intersections. So there was all of this going on in the convergent space, and there was a network formed called the Direct Action Network. And this wasn't, a 501c3 registered with a government. It was really just all of the individuals and small organizations coming together to work on these protests and to organize these protests together. So that was one section of the organizing. And then you had all of the big NGOs like Public Citizen and Sierra Club. And they would sometimes meet in the convergent space with some of those players who were central to that activity, but they really kind of kept their distance and took a different approach to organizing. The NGOs, in some cases, provided some of the funding and some of the money. But there was also this important aspect that Lori Wallach, one of the more high-profile individuals involved, who was working directly with Ralph Nader at the time, she called it the inside-outside game. And I think that's a really important term, monkey wrenching, actually, she called it, where, it was so important to have 50,000 people in the street doing what they were doing. But they also had people like Lori who had delegate passes into the World Trade Organization meetings, and were trying to disrupt things in there in a subtle way, right? They had relationships with some of the governmental actors. They had some relationships with some of the civil society actors who were invited into some of the meetings. And they were trying to influence some of those meetings from the inside. And those things were very complementary, because one of the things you see over the course of this week is that as the meetings deteriorated, that was happening in large part because some of the delegates of the World Trade Organization, particularly those from developing nations throughout Africa and Southeast Asia, they were getting more and more courageous as the week went along, because they were seeing what everyone was accomplishing out on the street. And it gave them the courage to push back on the European Union. It gave them courage to push back on the United States and Canada and sort of the big players that were controlling a lot of the meetings. So having that spread of interests and viewpoints in terms of big NGOs and individual actors and their ability to come together, that was essential. That was so big. And I think it's something we struggle to do today, to build those kinds of alliances, not just across left and right, but across sort of, let's say, establishment and those are sort of more anti-establishment.
That's really interesting because in reading the book, I was struck by the fact that this is a massive protest and work where no one individual seemed to be in charge. There were a lot of different people who were sort of running different aspects of it. I think when we think of big protest movements today, we look for a leader. Like that's oftentimes, I guess, inherently what we do. We say, well, who's running this? Who's in charge of this? But this seems to almost be the beginning of sort of the modern protest movement, where we're going away from the civil rights era in the United States, where we had big name leaders, and now it's much more grassroots at this point. Would you agree with that? That's what one of my takeaways was.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so it was very defiantly a leaderless operation. But what that actually means, and John Nichols, someone who's interviewed in the book, points this out. When you say it's a leaderless organizing, what that really means is there are lots of leaders. Right? There are lots of leaders. There are people that have jobs to do. Delegation is happening and everyone's taking care of their responsibilities. And some of those responsibilities are a little bit more high profile. For instance, those that were charged with the task of communicating with the media, right? So they start to get perceived as leaders and they had to constantly push back and remind law enforcement, those who were liaising with law enforcement, we're not leaders. We're speaking for people, we're communicating, but we're not leaders. So that was a really important part of the organizing. And going back to the direct action network and the convergence space, I can't over-articulate how highly organized they were, even in this sort of leaderless way, right? So they adopted an affinity group model, which meant they broke off into groups of 10 or 15 or 20 like-minded individuals who wanted to approach the organizing in a certain way. They wanted to sing songs and play music at an intersection. They wanted to lock themselves in arm by arm across an intersection. They wanted to walk on stilts, whatever the case was. They wanted to organize with kids, their children, bring their families, right? Everyone had different ways they wanted to approach it. And so they created spaces, affinity groups for people to approach the organizing however they wanted to approach it. And it was all about direct action, right? Objective, tactical objective. And I think this is really, 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 really essential. They were going to Seattle to have their voices heard and to make noise in the street. But that wasn't it. They had a tactical objective. Their objective was to block 12 intersections that all accessed the convention center so that the delegates could not get there to hold the meetings. They wanted to shut down the meetings. And they organized to do that. And the affinity groups all got assigned certain intersections to block, and they were all free to decide how they wanted to do that. The only requirement was that it remain nonviolent, right? That was the essential part of it, remain nonviolent and block the intersection. And so that tactical objective is really important. And they achieved it on the first day. The delegates were not able to get into the convention center, at least not enough of them to conduct the meetings. The meetings were canceled. And then the rest of the week really got derailed. And they weren't able to, the WTO was not able to reach a new agreement. And that was the whole objective. So I think that sort of high level of organizing, even in that leaderless environment, was really important. The other aspect that they had was a spokes council. So affinity groups would come together in the convergent space, this big warehouse that they had access to, and they would hold meetings. And each affinity group had a spokesperson in the spokes council who would represent their ideas. And people in the affinity group could pass notes to the spokesperson to have their voices heard, or, if they had a thought that they wanted to share. But there was an organized way for people to speak so that it wasn't just chaos, right? So the affinity group structure, the spokes council structure, and these things were taken from other parts of the world. The Global South had been really leading in a lot of these organizing techniques. The Spanish Civil War used the affinity group model. So there were ways. There were historic models for the way they were approaching this. But I think it's really important to look at that closely because, again, that's something I think that is lacking now. Even within a sort of diffuse way we're able to organize now, I think that point about tactical objective, that's often missing. And the final thing I'll say, too, is you have to remember 1999, this is the beginning of the internet, right? I mean, we're just a few years into the internet starting to we're still getting CD-ROMs from AOL in the mail at that point, right? Trying to get people to try this newfangled thing called the internet. And so this was really the first time you saw people organizing using the internet. And it certainly isn't like we know today, not social media and all that. It was emails, it was listservs. But that was huge. That was revolutionary because it allowed people to invite protesters from around the country and around the world to be there. And it's really important to emphasize just how international it was. There really were. There were French farmers there. There were people from Korea and across the global south, all around the world. UK, Germany, they were part of the organizing. And that was largely because of how they harnessed the early iteration of the internet.
We kind of got into my next question, but I mean, as I was reading the book and also as you've been talking, like just thinking of sort of historical parallels, I almost think of like, well, this protest in 1999 in Seattle would be like the 1968 Democratic convention protest in Chicago if they actually did it well. It's kind of like it's got a lot of the same sort of themes and disparate groups coming in, and they just didn't do a particularly great job at it, and certainly didn't get the outcome that they were looking for. But I guess sort of the big question that I had was, would this protest in 1999 have succeeded in maybe you can't even postulate on this, but do you think it would have succeeded without the internet? Because the internet is so important at this stage in history. This is the nascent time when you are being able to communicate and sort of organize on a grand scale. Yes, it is not the way it is today. You can't do things instantaneously, but you can honestly have a conversation and draw people in from all over the world. You couldn't do that before. Like you touched on it, but like, could this even have succeeded without that modality?
I don't think it could have succeeded at the level at which it succeeded. I think there still would have been massive protest and a big disruption. But I don't know. I really don't think they would have succeeded, again, at achieving that tactical objective of shutting down the meetings and preventing the WTO from reaching a new agreement. Because the internet was what allowed them to get so many people there, right? And we don't know the definitive number. 50,000 is sort of the number that's used most often. That's a lot of people. And again, coming from all around the world. So that messaging wouldn't have been able to happen. The organizing of ride shares and places to stay and all of that harnessed the early internet. So all of that wouldn't have happened, and it would have been a smaller, a more reduced protest for the week. Again, I don't want to say nothing would have happened. There would have been protests. Believe you me, people were driven to do it. It was going to happen, even in a regional way. There was a lot of energy in the Pacific Northwest to do this. But it wouldn't have been successful on the level it was successful. I think it's really important to understand. And one point that's central, and David Taylor, one of the organizers, makes this point, and he was a college student at the time, and he's still organizing, and he's been involved in some more recent campaigns where, 2,000 events are organized around the world at the same time. And he made a really important point. He said, we can do so much more now with social media in terms of messaging and getting people to show up and get out on the streets about something. But he highlights that what's lost is what they had in the convergence space. That fact that they came together in a physical space and shared that experience and helped each other find out where to sleep for the night, where to get food, make your way around town, right? All of this. That trust and those relationships, David really talks very well about how that's what's lost when you organize massive protest over Twitter or X. You don't have that level of trust. And so becomes very difficult to build sustained campaigns that can really make a difference over time without that high level of trust. And so I think it's really important that no matter how big protests get, they can be internationally organized with hundreds of thousands of people. But if the organizing doesn't happen on a local level with people who know each other and look into each other's eyes, then it's not going to be able to be a sustained campaign.
I think it's the sustained campaign part that's really important to note there. I almost think of social media now where it works as almost like social media allows you to do I'll call it the Mike Tyson mode of protest, where we're going to come out of the quarter and we're going to try to land one decisive blow in that first minute that's going to bring it down. But if we don't, that's it. We don't have the ability to sort of marshal the resources again and pull everyone back in. It's almost like this was the perfect time in 1999 where you had the ability of the internet to pull people in, but you still sort of had that tangential memory of the civil rights movement and some of the protest movements, the anti-Vietnam protests of the 70s and so on and so forth, where you had people with that institutional knowledge to say, we can keep this going. Like, here's what you need to know to keep this ball moving forward. Now we've kind of lost that part. So we have the ability to pull a couple tens of thousands of people onto the street for, let's just say, a Black Lives Matter protest. But it's probably going to be a one-off, if we can get that number of people, and it's not going to be something that's going to be sustained over the long run. And I think that's one of those things that we need to kind of go back and look at historically at this protest and say, well, what did they do better? Because there are things that they did better here, and we can sort of learn from that. But one of the other things that happens in this protest is that this is when we witness another major change in society, and that is the militarization of the police. And the way that the police are involved in this is a sort of decisive, well, I don't know if it's decisive. I guess that depends on, a lot of things are cooked into that. But I'll just say that this is, in my opinion, a start of a change. So I was wondering if you could talk about that for a moment.
Absolutely, yeah. In an American context, this is where we see police departments start to look much more like military personnel, right? So, and the Seattle Police Department, which by and large grossly underestimated what was about to happen, they did receive information about other similar protests in Europe and other parts of the world, protests against the IMF and so forth, that had become chaotic and in some cases violent, not violence against people, but cars overturned and that kind of thing. So they, on advice from law enforcement and other parts of the world, started using, this was the first time we saw in the States again, these sort of military fatigue uniforms that were padding, elbow pads, knee pads, in addition to the bulletproof vest, Kevlar helmets, all of these elements that they thought would be necessary to guard against what they call environmental debris, right? People throwing bottles and that kind of thing. But what you also saw too was a very swift and very violent response from the police in terms of using both tear gas and pepper spray. And it was pretty immediate. I think that, this goes into the lack of preparations on the part of law enforcement that many of them speak plainly about now in retrospect and realize was a big part of what caused a lot of the violence. But they were caught flat-footed, and they really strongly overreacted. The most telling fact is that they, on the first day, ran out of pepper spray and tear gas. Ran out of it. They sent cops in undercover clothing to Army supply stores in town to buy up whatever they could find in those stores. And then when that ran out, the FBI had to fly in some supplies from a military facility, I believe in Colorado. They did that in a matter of hours. So that tells you something. And then the concussion devices too, the loud booming sound that you hear, they use those as well. And then when all of the violence happened in Seattle and police, over 600 arrests, lots of lawsuits, successful lawsuits where people were unjustifiably arrested or treated violently. When all of that happened, the result, and this is sort of a perverse part of the story, I think, the members of the Seattle PD and other law enforcement agencies in the state were then asked to go around the country and to some extent around the world and give advice on how to respond It was, I think it was also too just sort of information intake. Okay, tell us about what you experienced and how we can try to avoid such violence. And I think that approach is sound. But what it really developed into, these sort of talking sessions between law enforcement agencies, was proliferation of use of tear gas and pepper spray, and proliferation of militarized police departments getting worried that they might get caught flat-footed the way Seattle was, and acquiring more military-grade equipment. So Seattle really is the origin of that, and sad to say, it's really just accelerated in the 25 years since.
Yeah, it's almost sad. It's almost like that we, after the Kent State massacre, decided to send those particular officers on a speaking tour of what to do in a situation where that's probably not the world's greatest person to send on that particular tour. But I wonder if you could if there was sort of like one thing that I think is amazing is that they are successful in these protests. So what allowed the protesters to actually prevent this vote from taking place? I mean, this is really quite amazing.
It is. It really is. And I think that, and I'm glad you asked that too, because I think part of the story is this amnesia that always happens. And Noam Chomsky is one of the interviews in the book, and he makes this point really well that in the U.S. we don't have lineage on the left, right? We're always starting from scratch. It feels like when there's a big movement around an issue, whether it's civil rights or globalization or whatever it might be. And I think that we can recognize an opportunity to see the lineage and to build upon it. You have things that have happened since Seattle in terms of specifically Occupy Wall Street and a lot of the organizing we see now around environmental issues. And I think that we don't understand really how much these things are building on each other, and they could be much more successful if we recognize that. I think that's important. So that sort of information sharing across generations and across efforts, protest efforts. But the other thing that's really essential to why these protests were so successful is what I touched on earlier, the tactical objective. And I think that's really what's missing. So look at Occupy. Occupy, was successful in a lot of ways, mainly because it put Wall Street in the center of politics, right? We didn't talk about Wall Street before Occupy the way we do now. It wasn't central to politics. Presidential campaigns didn't have to be so responsive. Bernie Sanders, right? These things developed after that. But I think that the thing that was not there with Occupy was a tactical objective, right? What are you trying to do? What are you trying? What monkey wrench are you trying to throw into the system? And Seattle, there was very specific. 12 intersections, block them so that they cannot hold the meeting. Non-violently block them so they can not hold the meetings. I think that specificity is important. And I think it's important for organizers to recognize opportunities to be that specific, to be that tactical. And I think that's where you really see a difference made. And I do want to just add one thing, because it's so important to underscore that the key ingredient was that the affinity groups could organize however they wanted, use whatever tactics they wanted, as long as they were nonviolent. And there was a small group of anarchists that most estimated was about 50 people that at one point started smashing windows to banks and Nike stores and all of that kind of stuff, right? So that was there. But what did the other 50,000 people do? They started linking arms around stores so that they couldn't smash the windows. They came out the next morning with brooms and trash bags and started cleaning up the mess, right? So, if you have such a big effort, you can get almost everybody on the same page, but of course there are going to be people who go outside of what you're trying to establish in terms of parameters. But it's important to be responsive to that as well. And I think that was something also that made the protest successful, the way the other 50,000 people responded to those 50 or so people who decided to break that sort of nonviolent covenant.
Well, it's difficult because if you're being met with almost a quasi-military response, even though these are peaceful protesters who, if you would have done any intelligence work, you would have realized really didn't pose any physical threat to any of the officers who were there, it is hard to sort of maintain discipline. And I think what's remarkable is how much they did, because that is one of the things that you do see it nowadays. You'll see some movement, and then you'll see calls for law and order at a certain point, and then that's sort of the pendulum swinging back and forth, and that's natural. I mean, that's happened throughout history. There isn't a whole heck of a lot that we can necessarily do about that other than look back and look for lessons. And this is one of those really important events that there's lessons from. Well, it's a great book. There's a huge amount of information in it, and we can't obviously go through all of it here today, and we've talked pretty extensively about it. But before we close, I always ask, is there any sort of information, anything that you really feel like people need to know about the book that is important?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I think I would say, I think it's important to underscore it's just a darn good story, as is told by everyone I interviewed. As you said, there's a lot of information there, but man, it's quite a narrative in terms of what happened that week for everybody involved. It's pretty riveting that way. And I think it's also a product of its time. In 1999, there were fight clubs. It was Y2K. It felt like a world that was scary, but also a world of possibilities. I think if we could carry that sense of possibility forward, that would be grand. And I think this idea too of a threat to democracy, which is again essentially what was at the heart of those protests. I think that's something that we're very much wrestling with now: the health of our democracy and how much it is or isn't working for us. And I think this book has a lot to say about that and can help inform a lot of the conversations we're having today around democracy and what its future might look like in this country.
I think it's probably one of the most obviously most timely books that I've done. I do a lot of books about ancient history, so that those are less timely. But setting those aside, I mean, the fact of the matter is we are still today very much grappling with this question of nationalism v globalization and who's going to win that tug of war. Is no one going to win that tug of war? Who's it better for? Is it better for everyone? So on and so forth. These are dramatic questions for us as we go forward today. And I think just like reading the different perspectives of the people in the book is really illuminating. And will help people realize that actually, you know what, we may have more commonality than difference. We honestly may, because when we're set against forces that are opposed to what a number of different groups in this country are interested in, we find out that actually maybe we don't hate each other as much as we thought that we do. And I think that's a refreshing lesson, honestly. More listening, less talking. I think that's helpful. And I think that's a lot of what's in this book. So thank you so much for coming on and for putting the book together, by the way. It's an amazing book, and I think it's going to do extraordinarily well.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for reading it so closely. And I couldn't agree more with what you just said. Absolutely. If we have 10 things, issues, and we disagree on 9 and only agree on 1, better to put all of your energy focusing on that one.